We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is only the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You are listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Thank you for being here with me. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and I'm also joined by my good friend and co-host, Matt Treadwell.
Hello.
This is the 36th episode of Evidence of Design, and it is also our last new episode of the year. We've been with you on Evidence on WXIR since March of this year. It's been around a 10-month ride, and I don't know about you, Matt, but it has gone quite fast, and really been privileged to be here and share this space with you listeners on WXIR. We've again had 36 shows, and we've tried to cover a broad array of topics. If you're new to Evidence of Design, we primarily talk about income and wealth inequality. Matt and I think that there's not enough attention given to income and wealth inequality, and that a lot of today's problems would make more sense and solutions would be better if people kept in mind or looked at problems through the lens of income and wealth inequality. And so our role here on Evidence of Design is to kind of raise awareness about income and wealth inequality and to take other issues and to reframe them and approach them and view them through an economic injustice lens. And so for our last new episode of the year, it's worth saying that this is a pre-recorded episode, so unfortunately we are not here with you live. Normally we would invite you to call in, but because of the holidays, Matt and I have to enjoy some time that we can get. We are here, pre-recorded this show, and also I do apologize that we were not live with you last week either. I had an emergency come up and things kind of happened. But I'm thankful to make this happen for you folks on our last show again of the year. And so what are we talking about on today's show? We are talking about, for the first time, and not the last time I suspect, climate change. So if people have been paying attention, there's been a lot going on with climate change in the past few months. And just to name a few things that
I thought you were going to say the past 100 years, but yeah.
Yes. Actually, you're you know, it's hard because, you know, Matt, we're fairly young, all things considered, and you know, I remember when I first learned about climate change in maybe the third grade or something.
I think my first exposure was learning about the Inconvenient Truth movie that Al Gore put out. Yeah,
which might have been around our third grade or so.
I think it was a few years after that.
A few years. Yeah, so now like climate change is kind of like a thing, but I always just think back and to try to wonder when it was sort of invented as a social issue. And of course it came far before our third grade. It just weird for me to think back when I conceived of it. But yeah, the more I study climate change, the more I am intrigued by it, to see these movements that have been pushing for the same conversations that we're struggling to have today back in the 80s and 70s and even before then. So your point is taken, where just because we're covering the last few months of developments in climate change, we are only getting a small snapshot. But an important snapshot, because there have been a few important developments in climate change, and that's the reason why we're having this show, to kind of raise awareness of a few developments. So in October, one of those developments was at the United Nations. They have what's called an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, kind of like one of the world's leading panels to research and combat climate change. They released a special report on the effects of the Earth's warming of just 1.5 degrees Celsius, which equals about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes. We're currently under that, right? We haven't reached that.
Yeah, The science says that the Earth has since warmed since the Industrial Revolution, when modern climate science and records kind of begin to take shape. Usually whenever you talk about climate change, you're talking about temperature increases since the industrial time, which was like the 1800s.
Yeah.
So since the 1800s, the Earth's climate has warmed by 1 degree Celsius, which is around 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a lot. Like, that does not sound like a lot, but we'll talk about later in the show how small degrees matter in climate change. And so this UN report that was released in October studied the difference in effects between the Earth's warming by 2 degrees Celsius or just 1.5 degrees Celsius. So only measured the difference between that 0.5 degrees Celsius, and it found that, oh boy, things aren't so great if the Earth even warms 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the world has been really looking at 2 degrees Celsius ever since the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, that big agreement that everyone talks about and that Trump infamously has pulled the U.S. out of. Well, now, this climate report really shows that, wait a second, 2 degrees Celsius is not, it's not even that. It's 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's even really bad too. And we really have to lower the warming of the Earth if we're going to do anything to save our future, literally.
So we have that report, and then just a month later, the second volume of a federally commissioned U.S. report on climate change came out. The first volume came out last year, I believe. It's a mandated report that comes out every 4 years. The first one came out in 2014 under Obama's administration. And this new report echoes similar claims that the United Nations report, which is that things are looking dire if we don't take action.
Yeah, this report you're mentioning, Matt, is the 4th National Climate Assessment. It came out in November, so a month after the UN's report, and it also says just what you said. Things aren't looking so great, even on just a U.S. perspective, that if we're continuing at our current pace, we'll be paying trillions of dollars of money and loss of human life, and our world will not look the way it looks like due to climate change.
So our main focus of today's show is climate change, but we're also doing a quick Week in the News segment to talk about some other things that happened in the past couple of days. Keep in mind that this is being recorded on Wednesday, so obviously some of this information may already be out of date by the time you hear it, but we feel that it's important to talk about nonetheless.
Definitely. We'll cover that Week in the News in just 1 second before that last piece about climate change is, again, we're recording this on Wednesday, as you said, Matt. December of this month, something that just ended, was the 24th Conference of Parties on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Oh my God, we're going to use so many big nouns today. But that was basically a big UN summit in Poland where world leaders met to figure out how they can implement and measure that 2015 Paris Climate Accord. So listeners, we just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you. October, a big UN report on climate change, says bad stuff. November, a big US report on climate change, says bad stuff. December, world leaders meet to try to create a framework for measuring the implementation of effects to curb the harmful effects of climate change. Those are the 3 big things that have happened in climate change, and that's what we're talking about mainly on today's show.
I'm excited.
Let's turn now to
some music.
We didn't do that yet, right? All right. So Matt, are you ready to take it away?
I'm ready.
Let's do it.
And that was Exploded View with the song Summer Came Early.
So turning our attention now to a brief sort of news overview. The last news report on this show of the year, Matt. Don't get emotional.
I wasn't.
There's so much that happens every week. And so sometimes on the show, folks, we like to do a brief Week in the News section, and we'll do our best to keep it brief here, just to really highlight some of the major developments that are going on. There is so much going on that unless you're really avidly following the news, and I feel like I do that, I feel like I avidly try to follow things, I still completely feel lost and submerged in the deluge.
And you don't even really have time to do that.
Right. Yeah, and I don't have time, and most other people, of course, don't have time either, just trying to put food on the table. So, listeners, we'll do our best here to cover some of the major things that happen in the news. Let's do it. On our last episode, our last live episode, we talked about the Gilets jaunes protests in France. These are the yellow vest protesters who were protesting originally French President Emmanuel Macron's fuel tax hike. The French government was going to raise the fuel tax hike to, again, here's a connection to climate change, to so-called try to curb the effects of climate change. If you increase fuel, if you increase the price of fuel, people will drive less and save the environment. So the French government started with that plan. However, it really kind of blew up, surprisingly, and the protests ended up engulfing the entire French nation, noticeably centering on Paris. People were harming national monuments, taking to the streets, etc., and really voicing concern not just over the fuel taxes anymore, but like the entire French government and establishment. These protesters came from both the left and the right, and they were, again, protesting a number of things, including French President Emmanuel Macron's pro-business, pro-capitalist, neoliberal policies that many French people felt like they were being left behind.
Yeah.
And so on our last show, we covered these protests as they were breaking, and now on today's show, we can report that Emmanuel Macron on Monday, December 10th, of last week, he made an address to France. He kind of gave a public address, and he said that he's going to raise the monthly minimum wage by about $100 a month. He's going to lower some taxes on the poor, but ultimately he's really not going to reverse that many of his pro-business strategies he has implemented, most notably a giant tax cut on the wealthy. So,
and I haven't been paying attention to this too much, Jason, but have you heard if this has curb the protests at all, or what the response has been?
As of the recording of the show, the protests are still continuing. They are much smaller in size. I think that also has to do with the fact that there was a terror attack in France a few days ago.
Shooting, right?
Yeah, there was a few folks lost their lives,
At
I
a
think.
supermarket, I think.
Yeah. And so there's a number of factors. Again, I'm no journalist or French analyst, but I think that Macron's address helped to curb things a little bit, but that the anger and resentment is still there. And these protests are, to me, a really seminal and shocking moment where we're seeing reactions against a neoliberal capitalist president. And again, we made the argument in the last show that we're kind of stuck in global politics in a bad place, where we get pro-capitalist people versus sort of racist, reactionary conservatives on the top of the tickets.
Yeah.
And so to me, these...
Cream of the crop.
Yeah, the cream of the crop, man. To me, these Gilets jaunes protests are pretty obvious direct reactions, against that sort of bad top of the ticket stuff that we're seeing around the globe. We'll see where they develop, though. Moving on to the next major news piece, really, in my opinion, is that yesterday of this recording, Tuesday, December 18th, it's announced that the Trump Foundation will resolve. Do you remember the old Trump Foundation, Matt?
Oh, yes. Actually, I do know a little bit about this.
Yeah.
But I'll let you talk about it before I say anything.
Oh, okay. So, if you followed the 2016 election, the foundations came up a lot. Trump claimed the Clinton Foundation was corrupt. Clinton claimed the Trump Foundation was corrupt. Well,
everybody wins.
Everybody wins. It turns out that the New York State Attorney General's office, originally led by Eric Schneiderman, then he resigned, and then now it's Barbara Underwood, and she will be replaced by Letitia James, who was just elected in the 2018 midterm elections. The New York State Attorney General's office found out that the Trump Foundation was essentially one giant scheme that the Trump organization or the Trump administration used to funnel money to its politics and its election campaign, essentially.
I read that back in 2016, when Trump was still a candidate and not the president-elect, that he held a fundraiser, supposedly, for veterans, and he claimed to have donated $1 million of his own personal money to some sort of veteran charity. I can't remember the name of it. And subsequent reporting determined that they could find no evidence of any such thing ever happening. And that it was done supposedly through the Trump Foundation. But that, again, that appears to have not happened. And it's just like an example of sort of the shady sorts of tactics that Trump is known for, and has utilized this foundation to to do.
I completely agree with you, Matt. Trump has since come out with tweets saying, whoa, we were going to shut down this.
Yeah, we're getting rid of it already. We would have gotten rid of it 2 years ago,
Yeah,
but they had to drag us out into this court battle. And
right. We would have stopped doing the shady stuff earlier just because we didn't want to get caught. That's not a defense, and this is, and he claims, why aren't they looking in the Clinton Foundation? I don't need to belabor the point that Trump is a corrupt politician, and this is just another
about his-
evidence. Just another evidence that he's
Getting your daily snark on evidence
Yeah.
of design. Or
using
your weekly snark, I guess.
Well, it's not even snark, dude. This is one other example of Trump using his position to advance his own personal wealth.
Yeah.
Period. Okay, we've seen that before, and if anyone wants to fight me on that, we can have long conversations. We can do an entire in-depth journalistic show about how Trump is using his position to advance his wealth. But the Trump Foundation will dissolve because it has been found corrupt by the New York State Attorney General's office. So sad.
Not gonna miss it.
Yep. And just one more bullet point on the list.
Does that have anything to do with Trump University?
Not that I know of. I think that's still under investigation.
Exciting.
Yes.
What a time to be alive.
Yes.
Anyway, moving on.
Speaking of investigations, though, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, he was supposed to be sentenced by a judge on Tuesday, December 8th, meaning he has already pled guilty. He's been cooperating with Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who is investigating Russian interference into the 2016 presidential campaign. The judge was expected to sentence Michael Flynn. He was expected to be given leniency because of his what has been
His
reported
cooperation.
as full cooperation. Right.
He asked for leniency, didn't
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was expected, really. The reporting said that he was expected to have no jail time. And this was really shocking. I was following this, and I was shocked to read reports that the judge kind of really lambasted Michael Flynn and said, look, I do not agree with your conduct. And let's remind listeners that Michael Flynn, who was the National Security Advisor of the United States of America, was found guilty of lying to the American public and
he? The CIA.
and intelligence officers and
failing to disclose acting as a foreign agent.
right. So he was lying to his colleagues, notably Mike Pence, even the Vice President of the United States,
Great.
about the fact that he was having conversations and back dealings with Turkish officials and Russian officials.
Did I not read that Michael Flynn employed the defense basically saying that he didn't know he could get into so much trouble for lying to the CIA? I feel like I heard that somewhere.
So this is where it gets tricky, man. This could go into a very long conversation. So we know, because Michael Flynn has pled guilty, and apparently there's evidence that he was lying to the American public.
Yeah.
And therefore Trump asked him to resign. Michael Flynn was lying. However, the counter argument used by Donald Trump and the right wing in defense of Michael Flynn was this long, convoluted story about how the FBI is corrupt and they were trying to entrap Flynn by making him not realize that he was sort of giving statements under oath to the FBI and making him not realize that he was under liability to lying to them or something like that.
That doesn't really sound like an excuse to me.
Well, yeah, there's this whole alternative fact right-wing narrative about this whole FBI investigation. Trump for 2 years has been railing against the FBI and essentially trying to destroy it and discredit it because obviously the FBI is not looking out for his interests because he's the one who's corrupt. Surprise, So, long story short, this was very interesting to hear the judge delay the sentencings of Michael Flynn. We won't know Michael Flynn's sentencing until early next year. This is what I'm so shocked at, Matt, though. Trump tweeted yesterday, on Tuesday, Trump tweeted, "Good luck today in court to General Michael Flynn. Will be interesting to see what he has to say, despite tremendous pressure being put on him about Russian collusion in our great and obviously highly successful political campaign. There was no collusion."
Is there speculation that Trump might pardon Michael Flynn?
There is speculation. What I am so shocked at is Trump has completely lambasted Michael Cohen, right? His former fixer. He has distanced himself from him, called him a liar and a phony.
After it became known that Michael Cohen had flipped.
Right. But it's known that Michael Flynn has flipped.
Right.
And Michael Flynn, apparently, according to Robert Mueller, the guy in charge of
been very
investigating
helpful.
Trump, has said Michael Flynn is very helpful.
That is weird.
It is very weird. And also weirdly, Michael Flynn's lawyers, I believe, or he made some odd statement sort of criticizing the FBI a few days before the sentencing when he was supposed to be a good egg. I don't know. Listeners, this is weird, and Michael Flynn did some bad stuff, and it's interesting to see where this goes. We don't know the end of the road on this. We don't know what Michael Flynn has said and told Special Counsel Robert Mueller. The point is, this was surprising that his sentence is delayed, and we'll see where this goes. More surprising twists, Matt, a week in the news. But first, listeners, man, we are just talking away here. Just having some fun.
Are we going to get to climate change?
We'll try to get to climate change. Holy shnikes, we're gonna have to rush.
Hold on to your butts.
Listeners, thanks for tuning in to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Thank you for being here. We will try to get to climate change ASAP. A few more quick things to cover in the news, though. Very quick. 30 seconds apiece. Let's do this.
I got one too.
Yes.
So 90 seconds. Go for it.
No, you go.
Me now?
Yes.
So this is really quick. I just heard this today. I don't know if it broke last night or this morning, but Jason, you don't have a Facebook account.
I don't.
So you might not know this, but Facebook allows you to sign in to other like subscription-based services such as Netflix or Spotify through your own account. And it was recently reported that apparently Facebook gave companies the access to users' private messages, the ability to view them, and the ability to delete them. Now, Spotify and Netflix have come out with statements basically saying that they did not abuse this in any way. But, I mean, why do they need to have access to that? I mean, it's just another, like, how do I put this? It's another misstep in a very bad year for Facebook where we had the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal breakout, and it's disheartening to see that private data is we're still finding out about ways in which private data is being misused, in my opinion, by this company.
Yeah. Yeah, the Facebook imbroglio continues. And we started off our year, Matt, actually. One of the first few episodes of Evidence of Design was talking about the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook.
Yeah.
And here we are. And here we continue. Surprisingly, the Trump administration announced that it will ban bump stocks. Those are the devices that you can modify a gun to essentially fire fully automatic.
Right.
It's what the shooter used in the Las Vegas shooting that killed 58 people. This is surprising to me that a conservative president, notably Donald Trump, his administration would ban bump stocks.
But they haven't been popular. I think who's the NRA's head?
Wayne LaPierre, perhaps, still.
Good, because I was going to say Walter Cronkite, and I knew that was wrong.
He's a journalist. No, not at all.
Anyway,
that's funny.
I think even he came out against them at some point, didn't he?
Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he might have. Yeah, it's just surprising, right? Maybe this is just an effort to give a little bit.
Yeah, to seem like they're doing something.
Yeah. Anyways,
That's
bump
cynical.
stocks are about to be banned, so I'm for that. Again,
Yeah.
one of our first episodes on the show was covering gun control. And
This is the callback episode.
yeah. It's the year-end
So call us back,
callback.
please.
Yes. All right. Two more, folks. Okay, I am so shocked. Wednesday of this week, when we're recording the show, the U.S. is withdrawing all of its troops from Syria.
I haven't even heard about this.
This is a big deal, man. President Trump is announcing that all of U.S. troops will withdraw from Syria. He's announcing this because he claims that ISIS has been defeated. They're not. ISIS is not defeated in Syria, nor will they ever be defeated.
There's still a civil war going
an
on.
Ideology. There's a horrible civil war going on. And also, guess who wins from this? Russia. The U.S. gets out of Syria. Russia wins because Russia is Syria's greatest ally in the region, if not Iran. Russia has lots of military bases in Syria. Russia wants to be a global power. I'm not saying any crazy conspiracy theory here. Literally, listeners, I'm not. All I am saying is from my international studies background, U.S. withdrawal from Syria means good for Russia.
Yeah.
And we know that Trump and Russia have some dealings going on where they're trying to help each other in some ways.
I don't know what to really make of this. I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked at Syria enough to know what I feel like my position is on what role the U.S. should be playing in that, but
Yeah.
I'm not excited about Russia gaining any sort of power, especially with Putin at the helm.
Yeah. Yeah, nor am I. Anyways, that's a big surprise, and we'll see what happens with that. Our last week in the news update, though, and
Don't get
this one connects
sentimental.
to climate change, Matt. We're transitioning to climate change. Ryan Zinke, the Secretary of Interior, is resigning.
Oh yeah, I forgot about this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, how could you forget when
How
he
could
is
I?
the most recent member of the Trump administration
Yeah.
to resign
So
or be
memorable.
forced out or fired due to scandal or whatever else? So Ryan Zinke is the Secretary of Interior. He's been instrumental in implementing a number of environmental rollbacks, like his former colleague, the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, who also resigned out of scandal.
This is totally unimportant information, but I remember reading that Ryan Zinke showed up for his first day on the job riding a horse.
Yes, he did.
And he claimed that he was going to run his department like he was Theodore Roosevelt.
Well,
Theodore Roosevelt was apparently a very famous conservationist.
yeah. He also didn't he kill a lot of elephants,
Probably.
which doesn't
Doesn't
seem
really add up.
conservation. Yeah, wasn't he the guy? He was famous. His White House had a bunch of like taxidermied animals from Africa.
Maybe he had an interesting idea on how to conserve animals.
Very.
If I kill them and preserve their pelts, they're conserved forever.
Literally, yeah, yeah. I'm not sure about that. No, there is something there, Matt. I'm not sure what it is though. But it also goes to the Alabama, the guy who ran for Senate in Alabama.
Roy Moore.
Yeah, who always rode around on a horse.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
showed up to vote on a horse.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is totally unimportant.
Anyway, climate change. We'll get to it. Anyways, so this Ryan Zinke, the Secretary of Interior, is the latest member of the Trump administration to resign. What about the whole draining the swamp thing? This guy is accused of using a charter plane to personally fly, costing taxpayers thousands of dollars.
Just like Tom Price.
Yep, that's what Tom Price, the former Health and Human Services Director, did. He's charged of using government vehicles for personal use, and he's also charged with having a shady deal with Halliburton, the giant oil company. Halliburton wants to have a giant development project in Zinke's hometown, which would also coincidentally raise Zinke's property value. So guess what? Another Trump administration official who is using their personal position for personal gain.
And I believe it was reported that he is supposedly resigning because the Democrats have obviously won a House majority in the elections this year, and he would probably face an investigation of some kind were he to stay on. And he actually released a statement, I believe, saying that he didn't want to put his family through something like that, and that's why he's resigning.
Yeah, he basically said that, look, I know a lot of investigations at me are coming, thanks not only to the Democrats winning.
So I'm getting out.
Yep, so he's getting out. But guess what? You can't run from the law, hopefully,
Yeah.
and these investigations will follow him. Just because you resign from your position does not mean that the law doesn't follow you. And he will, hopefully, I think, still be investigated for governmental misconduct. I'm not even going to read the list, I think, of all the people in
Oh,
the Trump
come on.
administration.
I was
Do you
looking
want me
forward to this. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, this will take the whole show.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we didn't want to talk about climate change anyway.
listeners, here is a short list of all of the turnovers in the Trump administration. This is the most turnovers out of any recent presidential administration.
Recent?
in
I think ever.
modern history. Yeah, I don't know if ever, because governments were run differently back then, but at least modern political history, the Trump administration in 2 years has had more
Last 50 years, we'll
turnover.
say.
Yeah, sure.
Whatever.
Whatever it needs, like recent memory, The Trump administration has a lot of turnover.
Since I've been alive.
Let me read you a few names and see if any of these people ring a bell who were forced out in some way or another from the Trump administration. It all started with how we started this segment. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn
Yep.
resigned within the first few weeks. FBI director.
January. It was January.
It was 2 weeks, man. And then I found out that he was talking with Russians and lying to his own people. Great. So, and now James Comey was fired. He was the FBI director. James Comey's firing preempted. It caused the appointment of special counsel Robert Mueller, which is a whole nother conversation. But James Comey was forced out. Remember Sean Spicer, Matt, the press secretary? Sean Spicer was forced out as well. Reince Priebus, he was the chief of staff.
I never know how to pronounce that name.
Yes,
Reince.
Reince Priebus. He used to be the Republican national chairman.
Yep.
He was forced out as chief of staff. Remember Anthony Scaramucci?
The Mooch.
The Mooch.
The best nickname in the entire administration.
He was the communications director for like
5 days. 5 days. Not even a week.
Until he made horribly disparaging comments to a reporter about other people in the Trump administration
Yeah.
that he worked with for 5 days.
Oh man, that's probably the happiest I've been all year.
Oh,
Anyway.
geez. Stephen Bannon,
Noted Breitbart owner and racist.
xenophobe. Who was also Donald Trump's chief strategist and campaign chairman.
He loves the gays. He sees them as early adopters.
Yeah, he says terrible things.
That's a quote. That's not something I believe.
Yeah, that's literally a quote from him. But so Steve Bannon was forced out, and Donald Trump famously said that Steve Bannon, when he lost his mind, when he lost his job, he also lost his mind. Oh,
that was when it happened.
Yes. Tom Price was forced out, Health and Human Services Director, for, again, misconduct.
Just like misappropriating finances for his own personal use.
Right. Rob Porter, who was staff secretary, was forced out for sexual misconduct or
don't even remember him.
battering. Yeah, I do remember that. Gary Cohn left. He was the director of the president's National Economic Council. It's worth saying, folks, to bring in the income and wealth inequality, that Gary Cohn was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. So the CEO of Goldman Sachs was serving as our National Economic Director. Period. End the show here. I mean, I don't know what else to say, but he's no longer there. And Larry Kudlow is in, who also has similar economic policies. But Trump famously fired Andrew McCabe. He was the deputy FBI director under James Comey. Trump fired him literally a day, I believe, before he was to retire and get all of his benefits.
Right.
His year's worth of service and benefits. Trump fired him. H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor who succeeded Michael Flynn, is forced out, and now he's replaced by John Bolton. Rex Tillerson, former Secretary of State, is forced out, and now he's succeeded by Mike Pompeo.
Go wobbly on the truth.
Yes, who was the former CIA director. Scott Pruitt, the EPA director, was forced out because of misconduct. Donald McGahn resigned as Donald Trump's White House counsel after reports came out of him not cooperating, but having interviews with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, is stepping down. Jeff Sessions, Trump's attorney general and one of his first supporters, was forced out after long disagreement. Trump had been lambasting against him for 2 years. John Kelly, the White House chief of staff, is recently stepping down, and he is being replaced by none other, Matt, than our favorite Trump administration official, Mick Mulvaney, who has been the director of the Office of Budget and Management, and then was appointed as the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, of which he's been trying to destroy. He is no longer director of that, but now he's the acting White House chief of staff. Mick Mulvaney has 7 jobs, and I don't know how he has time to do it.
He's like Jared Kushner.
Yeah,
he's going to solve the crisis in the Middle East.
Just solves everything.
There's been a video, I think, circulating in the past week of Mick Mulvaney making some pretty disparaging comments about Trump in 2016 before he was the Republican candidate.
Yeah.
Or when he had just become the Republican candidate.
I did see that. It follows other reports that come out that the Trump administration is chaos and people who work in it are not getting along well and just realize that the president is incompetent. But here we stand. Listeners, that was a long week in the news section, and thank you again for being here, though, on episode 36? Episode 36 of Evidence of Design. We are going to talk about climate change now.
I think the cold has gotten to your head.
which is the focus of this show. Matt, let's talk about climate change. Again, listeners, we started out here on 100.9 FM WXIR talking about the point of the show, which is climate change, and there were 3 big developments in climate change in the past few months. In October, the UN released a special report on climate change. In November, the U.S. federal government released a special report on climate change, and then this month in December, there was a big global conference in Poland on how to implement and measure some of the strategies in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Basically, these reports are saying that climate change is worse than we expected, and that conference was essentially saying, we need to do more to really get things going and to try to measure how we can combat climate change. So let's introduce climate change a little bit and say that climate change, as we mentioned earlier, is really, when you talk about temperature increases, you're always in reference to sort of the Industrial Revolution, when people started to burn coal and fossil fuels.
We understand the term climate change as, or global warming as something that is caused by human activity.
Mm-hmm.
specifically the consumption of fossil fuels.
Yeah, so that's like anthropomorphic, right? So that's a big fancy word to say that humans cause something. And let's introduce that to say actually in that UN climate report that was released in October, let me read to you kind of the purpose of that report. So here is a quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and their special climate report. They write, quote, "The overarching context of this report is this. Human influence has become a principal agent of change on the planet, shifting the world out of the relatively stable Holocene period into a new geological era, often termed the Anthropocene. Responding to climate change in the Anthropocene will require approaches that integrate multiple levels of interconnectivity across the global community." End quote. That is a very fancy way of saying humans are causing changes in the climate. The entire global community accepts that point of view besides the Republican Party in the United States. Literally. Like, there are other people on this planet who don't think that climate change is caused by humans. Jair Bolsonaro, we've talked about, the newly elected leader of Brazil, who's far right. He also sort of suspects the scientific evidence of climate change, but largely, literally, the biggest impediment to the idea that humans are influencing the climate has been the Republican Party in the United States.
And this is a big deal, Jason, because you have some statistics that you've written down in the notes here that I was glancing over. And while the U.S. only accounts for about 4.5% of the world's population, they're responsible for about 14% of CO2 output. Compare that with China, which has 19% of the world's population and is responsible for 28% of the world's CO2 output. We have about a fifth of the population, but almost half as much of the emissions. We're playing a significant role.
Yeah, so...
And if there's a political party or power that's active in sort of dismantling or discouraging research that could help slow this effect down, it's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. And I just want to clarify a few things on those stats there, Matt, that the U.S. has about 4.5% of the world population. It's really amazing to think about how small of a population of the world the U.S. is. Mm-hmm. We have so much tremendous power, but we're only 4.5% of all humans on the planet. But we still contribute, as you said, Matt, to 14% of all CO2 output. That means essentially that the U.S. outputs 3.5 times its share of CO2 output according to population share. So we have 3.5 times the CO2 output than we should. Mm-hmm. China only has 1.5 times the CO2 output. India, although it has 18% of the world's population, essentially 1/5 of all people on the planet are Indians, they only have 6% of the world's CO2 output.
That's crazy.
It is crazy.
That context is crazy.
There's international disparities, intergovernmental disparities, internation disparities in CO2 output. And so when you talk about climate change, you're talking across multiple levels. You're talking internation, intranation, individual, and I think what you're hinting on here, Matt, is really important to think about climate change as a global perspective, and then also the disparities that exist within it. And of course, you can go.
No, I'll let you finish.
Yeah, of course we can tie in income and wealth inequality, and that it tends to be the wealthier nations have higher CO2 output.
Mm-hmm. And I think that maybe this is illustrative of why, as to why the Paris Climate Accord agreement was seen as such a big deal, because it was this huge multinational. I mean, I think virtually every country in the world signed on to fight climate change. And while there wasn't a lot of sort of specificity established as to how that would happen, it was at least seen as a nice step to take in order to fight climate change, where people at least seem to agree upon this is something that's happening, this is something that we need to be doing something about, let's try to work together and figure out how to do that.
Mm-hmm. So that Paris Climate Agreement that you mentioned, Matt, in 2015, that agreement was signed by, like you said, almost every country on the planet, including the United States. And the goal of the Paris Climate Accord was to limit the increase in global average temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, which is like, it's like 3 degrees Fahrenheit. around there.
It doesn't sound like a big deal, but it actually is a very big deal.
It is a very big deal with literally disastrous effects on our planet, on the human species. Some would call it existential. Like the human species might become extinct because of climate change. And it sounds so ridiculous to say that because of the bombardment of daily stuff we have to care about.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard, I think, just sort of biologically for humans to care about something so far in the future that seems so far away.
And also, like 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Who cares, right?
Who cares? Just
That's the difference
wear
between
sunscreen.
like the inside of my car and outside before I turn on the heat when I get into it.
maybe.
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I
I'm,
don't know.
I'm just pulling that out of my. But you know, it doesn't
Yeah.
seem like a big deal because who cares? But I mean, do you want to go into some of the environmental consequences of this?
Yeah. So if the Earth's temperature rises by 2 degrees Celsius, then coral reefs will all die. Ice will melt.
Polar
and
ice
sea
will
levels
disappear
rise.
completely.
Yeah, completely. Depending on the temperature, sea levels will rise and completely cover coastal areas. Diseases will spread. Invasive species will spread. Viruses,
Diseases
bacteria.
will have a much
diseases.
more friendly environment in which to propagate.
Yep. Crops will be unable to grow as easily in most areas of the world because of droughts and worse growing conditions. And there'll be less water, according to droughts. There'll be mass human migration. There'll be increased tension and potential for intergovernmental conflict, such as war and fights over natural resources. It's completely destabilizing of everything that we know.
I mean, think of just how many, just like take one of those, like sea levels rising.
Mhm.
Okay, so the entire like seaboard of any given country has changed. Think about how many major cities are located near a port
Mhm.
or some kind of major body of water.
Yeah.
New York City.
Washington, D.C.
I mean, it's most of them, I feel.
Yeah, well, everywhere, yeah, because cities are naturally located near water. you
Yeah.
know? Yeah. So I hope we don't have to spend time on the show to convince anyone that climate change is bad.
Yeah.
you
Or
know?
that it's happening.
Or that it's happening. So, Matt, in our 8th show, when we talked about education and some theories and teaching about controversial issues, we talked about issues that are empirical and political. So climate change, for example, is an empirically closed issue, meaning the science supports the fact that climate change is real and happening. However, it's politically open, meaning that people are debating about what we do about climate change. So I'm not going to waste time on this show debating the empirical science of climate change. Like scientists say it's happening, right? And
Yeah.
I accept
That experts know
99%.
what they're talking about.
Exactly. But politically, like that could be open for debate. Unfortunately, though, as we started this conversation, the Republican Party in the U.S. tends to think not only that climate change is politically open about what we do about it, but they think that climate change is empirically open, meaning the science does not conclusively
Right.
support that climate change is affected by humans, meaning anthropogenic or in the Anthropocene geological era that we're now entering. And so the fundamental fact is that humans are changing the climate in a number of ways and for a number of reasons, and we need to do something about it literally right now if we are to have the best chance at living in as good of a planet as we can in the very near future.
So there's not much of a difference that we can make on an individual scale, but we can talk about some of the things that, we can try to do.
Yes. What can we do, Matt?
We could eat less meat.
So on an individual level, we could eat less meat. And why would that help, though? Like, how would eating less meat help to prevent climate change or whatever?
I don't know, Jason. Why don't you tell me?
Well, all right, fine. I was really curious about your opinion, but I think that the argument goes that if you eat less meat, you are less reliant upon a cattle or animal industry that consumes more energy to support cattle. And also, if you are eating less meat, in theory, you're eating more plants, and more plants means more sort of farmland that absorbs CO2 and is naturally healthier. So eating less meat, by extent, is helpful for our environment.
We can waste less food.
Yes, that is a huge one. Please, people, when you go to a restaurant or whatever, even in your house, we waste so much food.
But this is also like, I don't want to put this completely on consumers because also like restaurants have such huge portions these days.
Yeah. The organization Food Not Bombs, I remember they're like a nonprofit or something. They're pretty activists, but I think, they're a nonprofit, I think. And I remember hearing stories from folks from Food Not Bombs about them going to try to like dig through trash to get food that restaurants threw out, and like restaurants would yell at them not to take that food in the trash because it was illegal or something. Because our political economy is set up to not give out free stuff to people, because then that destroys capitalism. Like you can't just give out free things because then the market will collapse or whatever. So it's like, again,
Guess so.
income and wealth inequality. Let's talk about economic
Seem to be doing
justice.
that already.
Right. So we can really go into multiple episodes about how capitalism constructs the bad climate change. But
We can invest in renewable energy, although chances are if you're listening to this, you probably don't have a lot of personal capital to invest in anything outside of yourself or your family.
Yeah. Like, you can get smarter appliances. You can get green appliances. You can turn the lights off when you leave a room. You
Hybrid
can install
cars.
solar panels. You can get hybrid cars, right? Renewable energy is one of those things that the U.S. is really dragging its heels on, at least in the Trump administration,
Yeah.
the EPA, Scott Pruitt, Ryan Zinke, et cetera, who, the really powerful coal industry backed by the Koch brothers and the oil industry are
wanna
just
keep making
trying
that
to
money.
say, yeah, they're making that money. Again, it goes to capitalism.
They could be making money developing renewable energy, but
Yep. Exactly. That's like the most mind-boggling thing to me ever, where they argue that, well, we don't want to destroy jobs or hurt the economy by taking away coal jobs. It's like, just reinvest. That's the
Yeah.
point. The
Also-
future is in green.
anybody really want to be a coal miner? I mean, black lung doesn't seem like a fun time.
There was a huge exclusive report this week from NPR about sort of uninvestigated black lung and coal miners
Yeah.
that the government purposely didn't take
Investigate.
action to help them
Yeah.
because of the coal industry and the lobbyists. So another point to capitalism there.
Racking it up.
Racking it up, man. Just like Trump's list of people who've left his administration. I don't know.
And we can recycle and drive less.
Yeah.
And I think it is worth noting that while these are all like very important things to do. I mean, if we all participated in this, it would make a huge difference. But at the same time, climate change is not something that can be fought on an individual level.
Mhm.
And so there is much larger action that needs to be taken. It's not as simple as just saying, well, I'm just going to ride my bike to work now, and hopefully the coral reefs will be preserved.
Yeah, it's kind of yes and, right? So it's like the voting argument where my one vote doesn't count or doesn't matter.
Mhm.
Like you can't have that argument, because if everyone had that argument, then nothing would matter, right?
Right.
And that sounds really cheesy, but that's true. Like you cannot have that train of thought, because it's just simply incompatible with reality and logic of how systems work. And so the only way this system will work is if all of us take responsibility over our individual actions to make the climate better. And we can do that through simple things like eating less meat, biking more, investing where we can if we have the money in more renewable things. We can do that. But we also, it just requires a cultural shift to say climate change really matters, and let me take an action. And that also means holding our governments and corporations responsible. So corporations and government, the political economy is responsible here. We can have a tax on carbon. We can change the way our zoning laws work to create more forests and gardens. There are things that we can do. The scientific community can invent new technologies to suck CO2 out of the air, things like that. There are places that we can go, but the only way climate change is addressed is at every level. And I really want to highlight, Matt, these reports that were released, the one that we're talking about from the UN in October, the special report on climate change, and also, let me just speak about that one. That report said that we need $54 trillion of investment to change climate change, to prevent the climate from really destroying our planet. $54 trillion. That is
It's a lot of money.
It is literally historically unprecedented to require that much work and effort to do something. It is literally unprecedented. The report says it's possible, but politically improbable.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is the political will isn't there. The scientific community has been saying for decades now, like, we can do this. Here's a path we can take. And then politicians and governments and corporate lobbyists have been saying, don't care about the future, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so this is possible, and it's really easy to get like really sad about it. But we can do something about it. So They, again, this UN report on climate change says essentially we need $54 trillion of global investment to prevent the warming of the planet to a place that would really kind of make it unstable and really detrimental to humanity. They also write that if we actually want to prevent 2.7 degrees of warming, which again is that 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, which again is that threshold, that cutoff that the report is researched, to prevent 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, we must reduce our greenhouse gas pollution by 45% by 2030. So we need to slash greenhouse gas emissions essentially in half in only 12 years. And we need to reduce it, the report writes, by 100% by 2050. So get rid of fossil fuels by 2050.
That would be very ambitious.
That would be. Today they write that renewable energy such as wind and solar make up about 20% of our electricity use, but we would need to increase that to 67% very soon. So again, this is a fundamental reinterpretation of how we live our lives.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, it feels really weird to talk about climate change, listeners, on 100.9 FM WXIR. It feels very weird to talk about climate change because, again, it feels so far away. But then all of the scientific community and reports are saying that it's right around the corner. You know,
this is something that you and I could foreseeably live to see.
Well, we will, absolutely, if the science is correct, which I have no reason to doubt it, I guess. You know, I trust the empirical results. Our lives will be fundamentally altered in unforeseeable ways.
And foreseeable.
And foreseeable,
Apparently.
yeah. Reportedly foreseeable ways, yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, maybe there needs to be another evidence of design show that exclusively focuses on climate change and just sort of raises awareness about climate change issues.
I think this is like the fundamental issue of our time. I think this poses the greatest threat to our civilization, honestly.
There are lots of people saying that, yeah. But we don't think about that as we go about our day-to-day.
Yeah.
You know, that it could be literally existential, the same way that perhaps that nuclear weapons were existential. I want to connect that, Matt, honestly. I know we're kind of jumping around a bit, listeners. I'm sorry. Again, we're talking about climate change, and we are sort of... why we're talking about climate change is because there's been 3 developments in the past 3 months about climate change. In October, the UN released a special report on climate change about what effects 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming would have on the planet. The U.S. government, the federal government, also released the 4th climate assessment report in November about what effects climate change will have on the U.S. And then just recently, this month in December, there was a major summit on climate change in Poland, where world leaders try to figure out how they can measure steps countries will take to meet the targets set forth by the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. So Matt and I are talking about climate change because of those things. And we've been talking mainly so far about the UN climate report, again, that was released in October. I want to talk about something, though, Matt, that brought to mind from our most recent conversation about, like, is this existential and what do we do about it? Mm-hmm. And I want to go back to this guy named Thomas Malthus. He was sort of a British philosopher and economist in the 1800s.
Right around the time all this started.
Right. How prophetic. How coincidental. So Thomas Malthus, for those who haven't heard of him, his kind of big shtick, like if you read Thomas Malthus in a textbook somewhere, it'll probably mention Thomas Malthus and population growth. Thomas Malthus
He was worried about that.
Yeah. His main thing is that Thomas Malthus was really worried about human population growth. At his time, again, talking about the Industrial Revolution, which is the start of really climate change.
The mass consumption of fossil fuels.
Exactly, the use of fossil fuels. Thomas Malthus was seeing urbanization because Industrial Revolution caused a lot of people to move from rural areas to cities. Mm-hmm. He was seeing just so many people around, you know. People started to live slightly longer because they were learning to, like, wash their hands and things like that.
To learn about sanitation.
Germs, bacteria, exactly, sanitation. Cities had to develop in the similar way that we're struggling now. Like, cities had to think about how to support so many more people, the same way that our cities have to do the same way now in a green way. Yeah, honestly, man, this is bringing up a lot of connections. There's tons of people writing nowadays about connections between our lives now and how we have to rethink of the way to live in the world, just in the same way that people were struggling to think about how to live in the Industrial Revolution. This just came to my mind, and that's really interesting, but it's a different conversation. Anyways, Thomas Malthus wrote about population growth, and he was like, this is the biggest issue that faces humanity. We will not be able to support more people. Mind you, Thomas Malthus was writing at a time when there were less than 1 billion people on the planet.
Right.
Nowadays,
We have 7 billion.
nay 200 years later, we have 7.5 billion people on the planet. Again, unprecedented and ridiculous, not in a bad way, but it's in an observational way, amount of people on the planet, 7.5 billion. People at the time were wondering, like, is this guy true or not, right? Should we really, really care about population growth? Should we have, like, child laws where you can only have one kid or whatever? Is climate change the same thing? Do we need to care about it, or is it just sort of like, is it all hogwash? And I know we just said that we're not here to question climate change, like question the empirical evidence of climate change. I mainly bring this up because there is a main argument where it's like, look, okay, let's say, empirical evidence supports that climate change is happening, but guess what? Humans have always adapted. We can make technological solutions to climate change. We can invest in corporations. Yeah. Corporations will invent the science and technology
We can
to
adapt,
fix it.
as
Right.
opposed to. We can adapt to the changes that climate change brings about, as opposed to adapting our own lifestyles in order to prevent it.
To prevent those changes, right?
I think that we lose so much, though. That there's so much at stake in terms of like the biodiversity of countless ecosystems. I think in that ICPP report,
Mm-hmm. The UN report, yeah.
the UN report, it stated that if global temperatures increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above what they were prior to the start of the Industrial Revolution, that between 70 and 90% of all the coral reefs in the world will die.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of got into a rabbit hole and started learning a lot about coral reefs this morning. But they are just one of the most incredible, like, I don't even know what to call them, fixtures or ecological things in the world, and they support so many different species, and their extinction would likely spell the extinction of countless other species. And there's just, I don't want to live in a world where there's no coral reefs.
Yeah. And that's like the most mildest example too, I know people kind of colloquially will say like, oh, we're going to lose all of our coral reefs. Like we gave a list before this of all the other bad things that will happen with climate change. Like literally cities will be underwater and that war will happen and that we'll have no crops and droughts, So I completely agree with you, Matt, that like there's
That's the romantic in me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you on that. But I'm just saying like also it's so much worse than just we won't have coral reefs too.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I tend to sort of disagree with that comparison between current climate change and Thomas Malthus's worry about population growth. I do think that we won't just find a way out of this. Some people will, and those people might be the wealthy.
Yeah.
And so I want to end today's show because we're out of time, folks. Thanks for tuning in to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR on our last new show of the year. I want to end by saying that if we're going to really find a way out of climate change, we have to take into account what the report mentions. That UN report on climate change mentions this: efforts to curtail greenhouse gas emissions without incorporating the intrinsic interconnectivity and disparities associated with human climate change. A human climate change world may themselves negatively affect the development ambitions, end quote, of us all, essentially. So they're saying we must take into account disparities, particularly economic, if we are to figure out how to solve climate change. We need to start doing that. Man, we covered a lot today.
We did.
It was a little messy. I apologize to that, listeners. Theoretically, cognitively messy, but I hope that your brain is stimulated because what we're here for, and I hope you have a wonderful and happy holiday, and however that manifests to you. I know holidays can be pretty rough to some people, but try to see the light in some things and just make it out all right, and we'll
Stay positive.
stay positive, even though we just talked about climate change and
Yeah.
doomsday, but we'll make it out. So thanks for everyone for listening. I was your host, Jason Taylor, joined by good friend and co-host Matt Treadwell.
Always a beast, but never a burden.
What a great way to end the year. Thanks everyone for listening. Be well, be safe, and bye-bye.